Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and in this video, we will be discussing week 3 of this NFL season. Kicking it off, Thursday night, we have the Patriots versus the Jets. Obviously, the Jets ended up destroying in this one. Very, very good game. Jacoby Brissett had 98 yards. Not really great by him on the Patriots side. Drake May got put in the game. And he had 22 yards, and so he wasn't terrible, and that was kind of good to see him. Ramondre Stevenson had 23 yards on 6 rushes. There was just no ground game. Absolutely terrible. And out of the air, we had Demario Douglas with 69 yards for 7 catches. So good work there. On the Jets side, we have Aaron Rodgers get 281 yards and 2 touchdowns. Very impressive day by him. He completed 27 to 35 passes, and Braylon Allen with 55 yards and Breece Hall with 54 yards. Little 1-2 punch combo there. Very impressive. Actually only Breece Hall was able to get a touchdown there, but yeah, good work by them. And in the receiving room, Tyler Conklin led the team with 93 yards and 5 catches because, Tyler Conklin's the man. Moving on over to the Bears-Colts game. The Colts ended up coming away with the win, 21-16. Not really impressive by either side. Starting off with the Colts, they ended up winning the game, but Anthony Richardson played awful. I mean, 50% completion rate, going 10 for 20 on 167 yards and 2 interceptions. Horrible. Jonathan Taylor had a nice ground game. 23 attempts, 110 yards. He had a 29-yard long run, so that was pretty impressive, and 2 touchdowns. In the receiving room, nobody did anything. I mean, Michael Pittman had 4 catches for 36 yards, but other than that, they were all terrible. And then over on the Bears side, Caleb Williams had himself a pretty decent game, actually. Throwing 52 times, completing the ball 33. He had 363 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 picks. Not a bad game from him. Running back, there was no good running back. I'm not going to shout out either of them. And then for the receivers, Romo Dunze racked up 112 yards and a touchdown off of 6 catches. That was very impressive. And Cole Kmet had 97 yards off of 10 catches and a touchdown. So that was also very impressive from those two. Moving on over to the Chargers-Steelers game. Steelers ended up taking this one home, at home, 20-10. Very good game. Justin Fields had 245 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 INT. Pretty decent game from him. Calvin Austin had 95 yards off of 4 catches and a touchdown. Very impressive. I don't know who that is, but he seems to be pretty good. Najee Harris had 18 rushing attempts, 70 rushing yards, and a 21-yard rush. So good for him. And on the Chargers side, Taylor Heinicke threw for 24 yards at the end of the game, mainly because Herbert, I think, was injured. Herbert threw for 125 yards and a touchdown on 18 attempts, 12 completed. J.K. Dobbins had 44 yards on 15 carries. Pretty big fall off for him. And there was no good receivers. They all sucked. Next up, we have the Eagles versus the Saints. The Saints had 2 blowout wins going into this game, while the Eagles had struggled in the last game. So it looked to be a very good matchup. Also looked to be very high scoring. It was a good matchup. It was not high scoring. Eagles came away with a win, 15-12 against the Saints. Derek Carr looked rough. He had a fall from grace, completing 56% of his passes, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, 142 yards. Kamara still looked really dominant on the ground, 26 attempts for 87 yards. Very well there. Chris Olave had himself a nice game, 86 yards, 6 catches, and a touchdown. Very well by him. And on the Eagles side, Jalen Hurts had 311 yards and an interception on a 76% completion rate. So that wasn't so bad. He also had 25 yards on the ground. But Saquon Barkley carried this team on his back with 147 yards on only 17 attempts, averaging 8.6 yards per carry and 2 touchdowns on a 65-yard rush. Very impressive. And Dallas Goedert had 170 yards and 10 catches during this game. Unheard of. I've never seen a tight end do that. Very impressive. One of the main reasons that the Eagles were able to pull this one away. Up next, we have the Packers versus the Titans. The Packers were able to win this one 30-14. Starting with the Packers, Malik Willis looked phenomenal, having 202 yards and a touchdown on a 70% completion rate. But more importantly, he had 6 rushes for 73 yards and a touchdown, which for a quarterback is very impressive. Josh Jacobs had himself a pretty bad ground game with only 43 rushing yards on 14 attempts. And for our receivers, Christian Watson had 2 catches for 67 yards, but the ball was passed around pretty well. Moving on over the Titans, the reason they lost was clearly Will Levis. He doesn't seem to be their guy. He had 260 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. He's been selling every single one of their games this season, and it's mainly him that's the problem. DeAndre Hopkins did pretty well on 73 yards and a touchdown with 6 grabs, but neither one of the running backs did well at all. Tyjae Spears only had 7 yards, and Tony Pollard, the leading back, had 14. Up next in the early window, we have the Texans versus the Vikings. The Vikings destroyed the Texans in dominant fashion, and Sam Darnold looks to be an MVP candidate, putting up 4 touchdowns on 181 yards. Aaron Jones had a really good game as well, having 102 yards on 19 carries, and Justin Jefferson had 81 yards on 6 catches and a touchdown. Absolutely dominant by the Vikings, passing the ball around, being able to start up the running game and continue that, as well as keeping the ball in the air. Phenomenal on both sides of the ball. Moving on over to the Texans, CJ Stroud had 2 interceptions, 215 yards and a touchdown. None of the running backs did good. Cam Akers only had 21 yards, leading the running backs. And moving on over the receivers, in the air, Stephon Diggs had 94 yards on 10 catches. And I think Tank Dell actually got injured during this game, so we'll have to keep posted on how he ends up feeling. Up next is the most interesting game of the day, in my opinion. We have the Giants versus the Browns. Daniel Jones looked really impressive for the second week in a row, and this time they ended up getting the win. Jones had 236 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Singletary had an okay game with 16 rushing attempts for 65 yards and a touchdown. But the man of the match was Malik Neighbors with 8 catches for 78 yards and 2 touchdowns, putting up dominant numbers as a rookie, and he will be up there for Rookie of the Year candidate. Moving on over to the Browns, Deshaun Watson had 196 yards for 2 touchdowns, but stats don't really tell the full story here. He looks scared. He looks rusty. He doesn't look himself. They need themselves a new quarterback. In the rushing game, Jerome Ford led it with 37 yards, but he's not even really worth a mention. And Amari Cooper ended up leading the receivers with 86 yards on 7 catches for 2 touchdowns. And in the last game of the early window, we had the Broncos taking on the Buccaneers. In this game, the Broncos blew out the Bucs. It wasn't close at all, 26-7. Bo Nix had a pretty good ground game, putting up 47 yards on 9 rushes and a touchdown, but in the air looked very all right with 216 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions, and a 70% completion rate. In the receiving room, Courtland Sutton led the team with 68 yards and 7 catches, but other than that, there was really nobody else. Moving on over to the Bucs side, Baker Mayfield had just an all-right game with 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and 163 yards on 75% completion. Bucky Irving had a very dominant game on the ground, 70 yards for 9 rushing attempts, and a 32-yard long rush. Rashad Wright has to probably worry for his spot as he had less rushing attempts than Bucky Irving. Moving on over to the receivers, Chris Godwin led the team with 53 yards and a touchdown on 6 catches. And for our next game, we have the Seahawks taking on the Dolphins. The Seahawks destroyed at home 24-3, but that was no surprise as the Dolphins quarterback was Skylar Thompson, who had 107 yards on only 68% completion. In the running back room, nobody was really special, and even though Devon Achane is a freak of nature, he only had 30 rushing yards. In the receiving room, there was no good receiver worth mentioning. The Dolphins really need a bounce-back game next week. None of their players did well at all. Moving on over to the Seahawks, however, Geno Smith had himself an okay game with 289 yards and a touchdown, which isn't bad, but he did have 2 picks. in the running back room, they just gave the ball to Zach Charbonnet 18 times. He had 91 yards and 2 touchdowns. Pretty impressive by him. DK Metcalf led the receivers with 104 yards and 4 catches and a touchdown. He has led the receivers 2 weeks in a row, and he looks to be like a solid wide receiver 1 moving forward. Moving on over to the Panthers taking on the Raiders at home. The Raiders having a huge game last week, beating the Ravens, looking to have some momentum and go against one of the worst teams in the league. They lost by 14. Very embarrassing. Gardner Minshew had 214 yards, a touchdown, and an interception on 64% completion. There was no ground game, and there was actually a receiver worth mentioning who ended up being Trey Tucker with 96 yards and 1 touchdown. And Jacoby Myers also had a touchdown with 62 yards. On the Panthers side, the reason that they won this game, Andy Dalton, looking like prime Andy Dalton himself, replacing Bryce Young after Bryce Young has just repeatedly done terrible for the last 18 games of his career. And in the rushing attack, Chuba Hubbard had 114 yards on 21 carries. Who would have guessed? That's very impressive from him. Deontay Johnson led the receivers with 122 yards and a touchdown and 8 catches, looking like his old Steelers self, which is really good for this Panthers team, who needed a glimmer of hope to keep going. For this next game, we had the 49ers taking on the Rams at home. The Rams ended up winning this game 27-24, and Matthew Stafford had himself a nice game with 221 yards and a touchdown. However, this was the Kyron show. 89 yards rushing on 24 attempts and 2 touchdowns, and 27 yards receiving with a touchdown and 2 catches. Absolutely beautiful masterclass by Kyron Williams. Played phenomenal against this 49ers team and was single-handedly the reason on why the Rams had won. However, talking about other receivers, Tutu Atwell had himself a nice game, and that's about all the honorable mentions I have for the Rams. Moving on over to the 49ers, we had Brock Purdy throw 3 touchdowns for 300 yards, so a solid game by him. And in the rushing room, Jordan Mason had himself 77 yards and 19 carries, so not a bad game for him either. Jawan Jennings had 175 yards and 3 touchdowns on 11 catches. Insane work. Absolute masterclass by Jawan Jennings. However, it wasn't enough to win. And in the last game of the afternoon window, we had the Lions beating the Cardinals. In this game, Jared Goff threw 199 yards and 2 touchdowns with 1 INT. And in the rushing room, David Montgomery had 105 yards with Jahmyr Gibbs with 83. Braylon Allen and Breece Hall is a 1-2 punch combo, but Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery takes it to a whole nother level. Also, Montgomery had a touchdown. In the receiving room, Amon-Ra St. Brown had 75 yards on 7 catches for a touchdown. Moving on over to the Cardinals, Kyler Murray had 207 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and a 61% completion rate. In the rushing room, none of the running backs did very well, only managing to pick up a total of 15 yards. However, in the air, both Michael Wilson and MHJ ended up having 64 yards, while Marvin Harrison had a touchdown to go along with it also. It still wasn't enough to win. And during the late night game, we had the Chiefs taking on the Falcons. Patrick Mahomes ended up having 217 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception on a 67% completion rate. In the running back room, without Pacheco, Carson Steele ended up taking over, which is so impressive. Going from an undrafted free agent as a rookie, then making his way into training camp, proving himself in training camp and preseason, ended up being running back 3 on the depth chart, and is now starting and leading the running back room in Kansas City. And during this win, had a major impact. In the air, Rashee Rice, 110 yards, 12 catches, and a touchdown. Absolutely phenomenal game by him. Moving on over to the Falcons, Kirk Chains did all right. He had 230 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. Bijan only had 31 yards rushing. Tyler Ogiel had 32, and Ray McLeod had 20. I don't know who Ray McLeod is, but he has a pretty cool name, so shout out to him. Bijan Robinson also had 21 yards receiving, but the best receiver that they had was Drake London with 67 yards on 6 catches for a touchdown. but their team wasn't able to pull through at the very end with a 4th and inches play. They were not able to make it past the line of scrimmage. Up next for our Monday night game, we have the Buffalo Bills taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Bills massacring the Jaguars 48-10. Josh Allen ended up having 263 yards on 4 touchdowns and a 76% completion rate. Phenomenal game by him. In the running back room, Josh Allen ended up leading it also with 44 yards, and James Cook had 39 with a touchdown. In the receiving room, Khalil Shakir had 72 yards on 6 catches for a touchdown, but the ball was spread out pretty well. Moving on over to the Jaguars, Trevor Lawrence had himself an okay game with 178 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. He also had 3 yards on the ground. Phenomenal game on the ground for him. Etienne had 70 yards on the ground, and there was no really good receivers to shout out. Just terrible game by the Jaguars. They really need to bounce back next week. And for our final game of the night, we have the Commanders taking on the Bengals. The Bengals playing at home, losing last week, really needing a bounce-back week. They did not get it. Joe Burrow had 3 touchdowns and 324 yards, so it was a pretty solid night for him. Neither of the running backs did very well. However, Zach Moss did have a touchdown, so that was kind of nice. And Jamar Chase had about 120 yards and 2 touchdowns, so he had a good game there. Moving on over to the Commanders, it was the Jaden Daniels show with 254 yards and 2 touchdowns, along with a solid 39 yards on the ground and another touchdown. They just ran the ball all over the Bengals. Austin Eckler had himself 35 yards and a touchdown. Brian Robinson had himself 33 yards and a touchdown. And Terry McLaurin had 4 catches for 100 yards. So shout out Terry McLaurin. But yeah, what a great way to end the night. The Commanders solidly taking down the Bengals. Thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe and follow. And let me know if you guys have any questions. See you guys in the next episode. Peace.